Spectrum and Charter Cable Channel 6 and AT&T Uverse Channel 99. You may also stream online through our website, www.glendaleca.gov, by scrolling all the way to the bottom of the web page and selecting live streaming, which is the third icon from the left. For public comments and questions during the meeting, call 818-937-8100. Please don't call in advance of the agenda item. With this being said, may I have roll call, please?
Councilmember Brotman.
Here.
Devine.
Here.
Kasakian.
Here.
Najarian. Here. Mayor Agajanian.
Present. Thank you, Mr. Ajamian. Next item, please.
The agenda for the Tuesday, July 7, 2020 special public meeting of the City Council is posted on Tuesday, June 30th, 2020 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
May you read the second item on the agenda?
Correct. Mayor, we will be reading the second item on the agenda, which would be community development regarding proposed local urgency ordinance to extend planning entitlements in response to impact due to COVID-19 emergency orders. 2A, introduction of a local urgency ordinance extending planning entitlements.
Ms. Yasmin Bir.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, will go directly to Vilya Zematitis, Principal Planner.
Thank you, Ms. Beers. Mayor Agajanian. Good afternoon, council members, Mayor Agajanian. The item before you is a request from the Community Development Department to extend the planning entitlements that are expiring due to the COVID virus. This extension would be consistent with the building officials' extension of all plan checks until December 31st, 2020. This would not be unheard of for City Council to do such a urgency ordinance. This was done previously in 2008 and 2009 in regards to the Great Recession. The zoning code requires that all entitlements be acted upon within their 2-year time period, and that would include obtaining all required building permits. There have been a handful of cases involving single-family homes, multifamily residential dwellings, commercial buildings, and a few other projects that have since expired that are either currently in plan check or going to be expired very soon. And so staff is requesting that City Council extend these planning entitlements until the end to correlate with the building permit plan check extensions until December 31st. That concludes staff's presentation. I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Do you have any calls on this item?
No, Mayor, we do not.
Okay. Any comments from my colleagues or question? No?
I'll move the item.
The item just needs to be introduced as an ordinance.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I will introduce the item, the ordinance.
The ordinance is introduced.
Does it need a second?
It doesn't.
Nope.
Okay.
We'll be back next week for adoption, or the 21st for adoption.
All right. So we are done with this item then.
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Okay, we go to the item number 1, community.
Agenda item number 1, community development regarding requested update of downtown specific plan standards a year following adoption and miscellaneous proposed code cleanups. A motion to note and file the report and provide staff direction.
Ms. Yasmin Bir.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, we're going to go first to Councilmember Kasakian before I make any introductions.
Thank you, Madam Beers. Mr. Mayor and Council, I'd like to declare at this time my refusal on this matter. Since my election to the City Council, I have transitioned to the private sector in a company, Adept Architecture, who is a client and will serve as a source of income for my venture, for whom I provide government and philanthropic relations advice, is a related business entity to a company that owns property at 520 North Central and 521 North Orange in the downtown specific plan area. So although the property is currently entitled and for development, the city attorney advised that under FPPC regulations, there is a presumed conflict of interest when property owned by a public official source of income is within a zone governed by in a zone government by a specific plan that is under consideration for adoption or amendment. So the presumption may be rebutted by specific facts that the decision under consideration will not have material financial effect on my source of income. In this case, the projects have already been entitled and would not be impacted by any of our proposed revisions to the DSP. And I don't believe that my vote would pose a conflict, but at this time, I would not want to participate and vote only to find out, or to participate in the discussion, to find out otherwise, and have this whole item have to come back for reconsideration or tainted otherwise. So I'll be seeking the guidance and an opinion from the Fair Political Practices Commission on whether these facts rebut presumption. I've asked the city attorney to research this issue while I make this request for consideration to participate in future DSP matters. And furthermore, I'll make all of my correspondence with the FPPC available to any member of the public to review so that they may better understand these nuances of law regarding potential conflicts. So I apologize and I thank you for your time. I'm going to recuse myself to the chambers next door, and I'll come back after you're done having your discussion and hopefully be able to participate in the future.
Thank you very much. Okay, Ms. Yasmin Beers.
Yes, sir. Mayor Agajanian, members of the City Council, it's hard to believe that it has been over 15 months since we were before the City Council to discuss the DSP and the amendments that were before you then. We told you at that time and shared with you, and Council asked for us to come back to you a year later to provide you with an update and any considerations and cleanup that may be necessary. Here we are, about 15 plus months later with that information, and it has gone extremely quickly. With that, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to ask Mr. Calvert to take you through this report and provide information related to the DSP. We have a PowerPoint presentation, and he will take that moving forward. So with that, Mr. Calvert.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council members. As mentioned, we during the amendment process, we agreed that we would come back a year afterwards and review basically how the DSP has performed. In addition, there were also a number of factors, number of additional ideas that council had considered, some that staff has identified during the course of the past year that are maybe worth consideration of adding into the downtown specific plan. Also, during this period of time, we identified the need for some cleanups. These were things that just needed some additional clarification, just some things that needed to be worded a little bit better, some errors, mistakes that we found. So those are things that we wanted to come back and clean up as part of this process as well. So those are kind of the main components we want to go through today. We also want to highlight some of the projects that came through over the course of the past year, see how they performed against the downtown specific plans, the amended standards that are there, and see if there are any additional thoughts from City Council. So the goals of the downtown specific plan really were to improve urban design standards and architecture standards. This is really about high quality design. We had elements in there as well that we wanted to reduce the massing of buildings. We heard a lot of public comment, a lot of public feedback regarding some of the newer developments, particularly along Central, that those were large buildings that we needed to look at some design solutions to help scale those down, but also to improve the quality of the design. This also included improvement to the public realm. This is considering the sidewalks, the streetscapes, the parkways, and also the open space. We did have an open space requirement. As part of this, we did seek to enhance that to make more usable open space, more attractive open space that was more appealing to the public in general. As part of that, we created an improved community benefit system. And really the goal there is that as a project increases the amount of its allowable density that it pursues, that they need to provide some sort of community benefit in return. As we'll highlight in those, there were a number of priorities that emerged during that amendment process that we have included as part of this reimagined tiered community benefit system. One thing that's worth noting is that through this entire process, there was never a proposal to change density, to increase density, to any of the existing zones. All of these changes were aesthetic. They were to improve the urban design quality, the public realm, and the community benefit that the city was receiving from developments. My apologies, the slide is not advancing. There. So to highlight some of these changes that we made, the diagrams to the right represent some of the requirements that we put in place. One of the first goals was to really diminish building massing. As we had heard from the public, Central was creating a canyon-like effect. A lot of the buildings were approximately the same height. They were very boxy. They didn't express a lot of articulation in their design. So we put in requirements for roof line modulations, upper level step backs, building separations for facades that faced a long right-of-way to ensure that massing felt like a much smaller building, or in some cases, more than one building by incorporating some of these elements. Higher quality design was also a priority. Materials was a big point. A lot of times we heard that comment referring to stucco, but we were really looking at EIFS, some of that lower quality material that's not durable, that's not reflective of a timeless design, not reflective of quality design. So we put in requirements there that did not allow that anymore in the first 20 feet of the building to ensure that materials at the streetscape were of high quality. We did put in requirements that minimize the amount of that could be used in upper stories as well of the facades. Maximum of 40% of a facade could incorporate an EIFS material.
Mr. Calvert, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes, please.
Speaking of high quality materials, and I'm not sure, the Altana residence, the multifamily, isn't that the name of it on Central, the Altana?
That's one of them, correct?
Are there tiles that have fallen off of the facade of that building?
I'm not sure. I know that they're doing some work and maybe some maintenance. Depending on the material, depending on the construction, it may just need a routine maintenance, or they may just be swapping out the material for something else.
Okay, thank you.
So to create greater visual interest, and this is really applies to breaking down that massing again and also that pedestrian environment, is to incorporate facade modulations so that a building did not just continue at the same plane for 200 feet, 300 feet, whatever it may be down that block, but to really try to break that up and create that visual interest. This also included enhancing the design of building entries, lobbies, and stoops of things of that nature. Another strategy was to create improved streetscapes. And this was really to try to activate the building frontages a little bit better. Oh, my apologies.
Can you go to the,
Yes.
go back? What we are trying to show on the first two pictures which you have on the right, what you are trying to show on those two pictures, what's the difference between the top two? I'm not talking about the bottom one. What we are trying to show in here?
Those are diagrams that we incorporated, and this is something we'll touch on a little later in the presentation as well, is that we really wanted to make the new version of the DSP to be graphic. So that people understood what it was that we were asking for them. And these first two graphics are highlighting, one, that we require a change in building height. If a building facade is over 150 feet long, we require some sort of change in that elevation so that it creates some modulation in the roof line. The second one is looking at that on the vertical plane, that the facade also has to have some sort of modulation so the building recesses or protrudes out to create some visual interest along the sidewalk.
Okay, but there are not major big difference between the two, are there?
The graphic representation, they use some of the same model. One of them is highlighting the dimensional requirements along the facade. The other one is highlighting the dimensional requirements along the rooftop. And there are two different measurement requirements that we have in there for that.
Okay, thank you.
So in order to improve some of the streetscapes, some of the comments that we heard was the need for wider sidewalks, more attractive streetscapes, more attractive building frontages. So what we did was come in and, thank you, is to set up a street typology system. And that was really to look at the streets, recognize that every street or classifications of streets could be different, that we had different goals. Some are a little more retail intensive, some are a little more residential intensive, and that we wanted those street characters to reflect that. So as part of that, we created designations for the streets, which really focused on the width of the sidewalk, the width of the parkway, the width of the building frontage that we wanted to incorporate. So the idea that we wanted wider sidewalks, we wanted greener parkways, and we also wanted to have some activated space in front of the entries of buildings, whether that be through stoops, or if there's a restaurant or a retail use, there was some opportunity to activate that with outdoor seating or something else that would really kind of draw visual interest. Another big move in here was the open space requirement. Right out of the gate, we doubled the requirement for the amount of open space provided from any development.
Excuse me again. Go back to the prior one. What's that chart? It's so small here and so small there. What you're showing there?
So what that blue graph represents below is it's the number of the street classifications. You can see there's 5 different classifications in there. And what that does is it sets the total width that we want to see for that public realm, and that includes the parkway, the sidewalk, and the building frontage zone. And depending on the street classification, those numbers change. In some locations, we have an 8-foot wide requirement. Other locations, we may have a 12 for a sidewalk.
Okay.
So as part of the open space requirement, what we had heard from about some of the newer developments is we saw open space that was not 100% open to the sky. It was not necessarily usable from the perspective in which it was designed, the materials incorporated into it, the overall layout. And we were seeking to create a more attractive open space, an open space that was usable and inviting and welcoming to the public, but also of the appropriate scale that was representative of the development scale that was being proposed. As part of that, in addition to increasing the overall percentage for a by right project, but also having enhanced requirements for projects that exceeded higher levels of density, we also put in particular design requirements. And that relates to improved materials, a certain number of seating per linear feet to make sure that people could sit down and use the space, of some sort of feature element, whether that's art or some sort of other vegetation, but to really up the design standards of that open space so that we didn't just end up with large 40 by 40 concrete paved areas. The tiered community benefit system, what was imagined here was breaking the maximum development potential of a site into 3 categories. And essentially each one of these categories has a certain ask from any property that is applying for development. In that first tier, we have a more trimmed down requirement, excuse me, I'm gonna go forward 1 slide here before I go back, of the standard open space requirement that we have in our code. As also part of that, we require that 20% of the units be at least 2 or 3 bedrooms to really accommodate for diverse household types in downtown. That was one of the comments that we heard from council, was to make sure that we weren't just getting a lot of 1-bedroom apartments, that we were not filling downtown with just singles, but this is a place for families, for multi-generational households, for any kind of household composition, basically. The middle tier starts to increase those requirements. You can see the open space percentage goes up by another 1%. That mix of housing units goes up by another 10%, goes up to 30% of units proposed. So this is for multifamily. And then that top tier goes up another level. It requires 2% more open space, and it also requires 40% of those units to be 2 or 3 bedrooms. Again, in the effort that as that development starts to scale up, we're providing more and more opportunities for more and more different households to reside in downtown. There was also a third element to that allowed the applicant to choose. There was a list of mobility improvement requirements that they could make, whether that be bike share, car share, or transit passes. They could pursue 2% public art being installed on site. Right now, we require 1%, and that could be paid into a fee. Council had expressed an opinion that if they were going to pursue that maximum potential development, that if they chose the public art option, that would all go on site. Therefore, the money would not go into a fund, but we would actually see that open or that public art being incorporated into the design. And the third was priority uses. And this one was left a little bit open-ended, and this could have been something that came back to council if an applicant wanted to pursue it. But essentially, if council or the community identified a certain use that was needed in downtown, maybe one that was missing, whether that be a school or a grocery store or something along those lines, that if the applicant were to incorporate that as part of their development, then that would be something that they could choose as well to achieve their maximum development potential. So is any one of those 3 options in addition to the open space, in addition to the diverse housing mix requirement. I'm going to back up 1 slide here. One thing that we wanted to touch on is that we also did raise the building height in the Orange Central and Broadway Center A districts. And the main reason why we did that is we looked at some of those sites there. They were larger sites with the potential for much more open space. The height requirement that was originally in place was essentially in this zone where most applicants are not going to build because it's just not cost efficient to build a building at 140 feet, 180 feet. You really need to kind of hit that 200, 220 foot mark. It's kind of the Goldilocks zone, if you will, for a building to actually pencil out if they're going to build high rise. At the same time, that also opens up the availability of that ground level space for open space. The idea that we would not get as many of the shorter 5-story kind of squat buildings that we've seen, but rather we would get taller, narrower, slender towers that would also free up more room for open space. That was the reason for raising the height in that location. Note that we did not raise density, we did not change the allowable density, and we also did not raise heights in any other location throughout the DSP. So when we started this process, we looked at what we could do with the code, and essentially this massing model represented that. A number of the things that council identified and the community identified as issues, whether that be a large massing, unarticulated design, lack of good quality open space. We've heard balconies were an issue, and they had this appearance that they were sort of tacked onto the building. And what we were really trying to create was what you see in this graphic here, something that is a little more articulated, that has better open space. These two models are the same density. It's some of the same requirements even. It's just changing some of those aesthetic standards to ensure that a development will provide the things that we wanted to see in terms of good quality design, reducing that massing, and providing high quality open space as well. This massing model actually kind of highlights one of the projects that we'll discuss in a moment, where they did pursue these kind of strategies, and we did get something rather similar to this simple massing model. So in additional kind of summary to that, one of the things we also tried to do is, rather than having guidelines, we converted to standards where we could. Rather than saying someone should do something, they shall do something. And that was really focused on the idea to remove some of that subjectivity, to remove some of that debate with applicants on whether or not this was actual facade modulation or not. We put in dimensional requirements, measurable requirements, not saying that they were only held just to that. They still have the flexibility and freedom to do something different, but we wanted to set a baseline that essentially would get us at least the minimum of what we would hope to see from these projects, and then be able to pursue something even greater. But it was much harder to do by using guidelines rather than standards. We reformatted the document. Mayor, the graphics that you had referenced, that was one of our efforts, is to create things that were a little more illustrative, if you will, so that we could actually show applicants what we wanted to see rather than try to explain it through words, which oftentimes, when you're trying to come up with something aesthetic, something that's design related, it's much easier to exhibit and understand through those kind of graphics. And really, again, providing those objective, measurable standards, something that we could measure against, that we could definitively say, yes, this has met the objectives and the goals of the DSP. So over the course of the past year, we've seen a total of 6 projects. In your council report, we highlighted 5. One of them we did not, because it wasn't actually a building typology. We will touch on it here this afternoon. 2 of those were hotels. 1 was a multifamily. 1 was a commercial office, a medical office, and then that last one was the outdoor food market for the Galleria. These amended standards did not apply to the 517 East Broadway medical office building. Would note that they did pursue many of the requirements that we had in the amended DSP, but they were not required, as they were considered a pipeline project at that time. Also, the outdoor food market, not all of those standards applied either, because it was not an actual building, but they also, in good faith and effort, tried to meet many of the requirements that we were pursuing as part of that. So the first project, the Hilton expansion, this is at 100 to 190 West Glenoaks. This is a 25-story tall building. Over 200 hotel rooms were proposed as part of this. It met all of our public realm requirements, including sidewalks and open space, including improving some of the existing open space that's on site. They also met the building frontage zones requirement, which for this project, some of those were a bit challenging because this was a very narrow site, but they were able to meet all the public realm requirements that we asked for. You can see in the elevation, they have some of the facade modulation and height modulation requirements that we asked for. The one thing that they did ask for was an exception from a tower step back requirement that we have in place. And this is one of our cleanups as well, is that because the lot was so narrow, if they were to provide the 60-foot setback that we wanted from towers above 60 feet in height, essentially that tower would no longer be buildable. And the whole goal behind that step back is to really create a narrow, slim profile for the towers so that we didn't get large rectangular masses. And in this case, we felt that this site already met that objective because it was such a narrow site. You can see that slim profile when you're looking east. It is a very narrow tower from that perspective already. Council did approve this project for a stage 1, and they will return for a stage 2. Second is Hotel Indigo. This was probably the project that council expressed the most satisfaction with in terms of meeting the DSP requirements. This one also met a lot of those intents that we had. If you go back to that white massing model that I had shown where we had transitioned from that kind of larger box to something that was a little more broken up, a little more articulated, this project really seemed to embody those goals and principles. This project was fully compliant with the downtown specific plan standards and incorporated high quality materials using brick, steel, other elements, limited EFIS to really just the rear facade, and it was a very small percentage. Roof line and facade modulation were incorporated, upper level step backs as well. Building separation, as you can see, and that's where they incorporated their outdoor open space as well, which also exceeded our requirements. 620 North Brand, this was to redevelop a site while maintaining the existing bank building that is on that parcel. It was a proposed 348 multifamily unit building. It had several levels of parking above grade. The community benefit, they did provide all of the additional publicly accessible open space that was required. They met the diverse housing mix as well, the 40% 2 and 3 bedrooms. They did meet some of those measurable standards in terms of facade modulation and height modulation as part of that. Overall, this is a 32-story tall building, 350 feet. As stated, it was fully compliant. My apologies.
On this building, they came forward with the parkings on ground level.
Correct.
And we said that's not acceptable, it should go underground, take the entire land and make 2-level parking lot. The parking lot should be in 2 levels, underground. It shouldn't be over the ground, that's what we have decided.
So we have a provision where if the parking is wrapped with residential units, which is what they did in this initial pass, but during this council session, council did ask that they bury the parking as part of a condition of stage 1 approval, which is what they've gone back to work on, is to bury the parking below grade and not bring all that parking above grade per council's request at that meeting.
Okay, so it's not over the ground.
No, they have not returned yet with their stage 2, but that is something that they're responding to, and they have responded to in what we've seen thus far.
But they are not gonna bring stage 1 back?
No, this project was approved with conditions, and that condition was to put the parking below grade. So
Okay.
they'll return
All right.
with a redesign, a change design that will
All right,
put
that's
that
fine.
parking below grade.
Okay, now.
I have a
thank-
question about this.
Please, go ahead.
Was a CEQA done on this, or does it have to be done on this?
Not until stage 2 do they have to get into traffic analysis and CEQA and everything else. Really, that stage 1 is just about massing and design when that's brought forward to council.
Why wouldn't it make sense to get the CEQA out of the way first? Because the massing could be an issue. CEQA, I don't understand why you would wait on after stage 1 to do CEQA.
You're correct. It potentially could be. The goal of the stage 1 is really to get council input in the beginning to see if they are heading in the right trajectory, the right design aesthetic, site planning, things of that nature. So depending on those outcomes of environmental analysis and the stage 1 design review with council, they would have to go back and make those changes. But it's really kind of that first pass to get feedback from council to see what council thinks of that project to begin with.
And stage 1 is not an approval from a CEQA perspective. It's just preliminary, it's a preliminary design. Council's giving its blessing to the concept, as Mr. Calvert said. It's not, so we don't require it because it's not treated as an approval. They can't do anything with it. It's not an entitlement. They can't go to the
Yeah,
building
but
permit.
council's giving its blessing without having all the facts.
No, that's not true. It's when I say blessing, it's on the design concept, the massing and the scale, all the other aspects of it, traffic, noise, everything, all that other stuff, the council will review that when it comes back for stage 2.
Yeah, doesn't make sense to me.
Well, stage 1, if I can get involved, is the basic idea of the building. This is what I complained before, that stage 1 and stage 2, they were coming forward together and create lots of problems. So stage 1 is you make sure the idea is in there, and then they're gonna work on the detail of it at a later time. This is that all engineering firms are doing. There's a stage 1, they present to the project owner, say, okay, this building will be this many rooms or this many.
And in all other cities that we're
apartments.
aware of, they only go to CEQA after stage 1? Is that the norm?
It's a relatively standard practice, correct?
Maybe if I give you an example of the reason. In stage one, you're looking at site planning and access to the site. If you did your environmental review at stage one, it would be based on whatever you planned for that site. Come to stage one, if council changes that access, you have to go back and redo the study again. So really as Mr. Calvert said, we're looking for the general direction. Are we headed in the right direction? Are we going where you want us to go in mass, scale, how we access the site? Yes, we are? Okay. And then you go study that before you get to your final approval where the council gives any kind of entitlement. You do that review after you've gotten that preliminary direction from the council, and you go do it. One of the things we'll talk about when you combine the stages, the developer is taking the risk that the council won't change some of those things and require them to go back and look again.
But something like, an issue with a historic resource, the massing and the location and the placement relative to that resource is something that would come up in stage one, and yet without the CEQA, you wouldn't really be able to have all the facts that you could use to analyze that. That seems to be.
You could tell them at that point, I'm a little concerned about that, and then they would know to study that in their environmental document. Regardless of whether you bring it up or not, they will have to approach that in the cultural center. They will have to look at it. And if it says it's an impact, they're going to come back and either change the design or ask the council to adopt some kind of statement of override. But that's after they get that preliminary review from the council. They're certainly, and we're certainly looking at it. Our staff would generally understand historic resource, you might be encroaching on it, you want to do this, that, or the other thing as part of our analysis of that first statement.
And I would know the staff is very good at, making sure that the developers who get a stage one approval are under no illusion that their project won't change after they go through the CEQA process. And the applicants who've been through the city process more than once clearly know this, that things can change between stage one and stage two.
Next.
You go to the next one. 340 North Central, this is one of the most recent projects that was reviewed. Three-story office building, about 14,000 square feet. This one was also fully compliant with the DSP standards. It should be noted that some of them did not apply to this site, simply because it was so narrow. Understanding that some of our narrow lots that are below 60 feet, below 50 feet, public open space, roofline modulation, things of that nature just are not necessarily applicable. We were looking to make those changes for large buildings.
Excuse me. 340 North Central was the one that council did not approve.
Yeah.
Correct, and we'll get to that point in just a moment as well. So this was fully compliant with the DSP. It did pursue stage one and stage two combined, and that is a point that we will take up later in this presentation as a decision point with council. Does council want to allow projects to still come as a combined stage one or two, or to see those broken up? Ultimately, council, which did have the discretion to do so, asked that this project go back and do additional analysis regarding its contextual location, especially a visual impact, the massing impact on the potential historic contributor next door, which was the Armenian consulate building. So ultimately, this project was denied. They will have to come back with a redesign in regards to that. Really, what we were looking at is the aesthetics, that they did meet the intent and the requirements behind those development standards that we had put in place. Granted, this was a little bit of a unique situation because it was next door to potentially historic contributor.
Okay, you have written. All right.
517 East Broadway, this was the project that was not, was the DSP standards were not applicable. What I will say is this project did a really good job, and they gave us a really strong effort to try and meet our DSP standards regardless. They were in the application process. They were a pipeline project during our amendment process when we were developing these standards. They worked very closely with us to make sure that we had the facade modulation, the roofline modulation, open space requirements, and really came through with a very unique though modern design that council also approved as part of a stage 1 and stage 2 review. One thing to note on there is they were conditioned to reduce the size of the sign, which is something that they have brought back and have revised. And then there was Urban Space. This was an exterior dining installation at the Galleria. This was not a building, but it was something that we did ask them to meet some of our objectives. And that was to incorporate a variation of materials, colors, openings, penetrations, things of that nature, so that even though this was an outdoor kind of food hall, food market, it still functioned, still had the feeling of some of the things we were looking for in our development standards. This one also had 2 creative sign applications as well with it.
Excuse me, on that project, they still want to do it?
We have not heard anything since the approval. I know, things are a little bit up in the air right now, so we'll see how that pans out. But they did receive council approval.
I know we approved, but I just wonder, considering coronavirus and what's going on in this country, I was wondering if they're gonna pursue the project.
That we're not sure of quite yet, so.
True.
So that recaps some of the projects, the significant ones that came through in the past year. This next section is really focused on additional considerations. And these were things that council brought up back during the amendment process that maybe we didn't have enough time to study. These things came up when other projects would come in for review, and it would stoke a conversation regarding those requirements or standards. And what we wanted to do was bring this forward. Council had asked in many cases that we bring that as part of the DSP update and get council's feedback on how you would like us to study these kind of 12 distinct points. It should be noted that we're not making any final policy decisions today. We really want the direction from council. Do you want us to go and study this potential change? If so, how would you like us to do that? So prior to the meeting, you were given a scorecard for you to be able to kind of jot down thoughts, ideas, or preliminary opinions. At the end of each one of these, we will pose the question that we're asking, but the idea is that when we are finished with the presentation, we would go back through one by one and get council's opinions and votes on how to move forward with each of these distinct elements.
Where's the scorecard?
It should be Exhibit 1 in your council report.
At the end of the report.
Very good. Thank you.
So the first is LEED certification, or really how I would probably classify this as sustainability. We heard comments from the public, we heard comments from council as well, to consider requiring LEED Platinum for all new developments in downtown. And what we found as part of this process is that there are a number of other strategies we could also look at, and we wanted to bring forth those strategies to council and see which of these you would like us to pursue. All of them have their benefits. They all have different varying scales in terms of how we like to pursue or try to achieve sustainability. LEED Platinum for buildings is focused on that discrete element, that individual building, and that building having that optimal sustainability. It's the highest certification you can achieve through the LEED process. But we also discovered that there's LEED neighborhood development, and there's also LEED cities, and there's also a concept called eco districts. In the first two LEED concepts, neighborhood development and cities, they still require that individual buildings within a district achieve LEED certification, but it looks at sustainability through a more holistic, more comprehensive perspective. It looks at the context of buildings. What are the uses that are nearby? Is it promoting walkability? Is it promoting water retention and streetscapes? Is it doing more than just the single sole discrete building? Is our community, is this district really sustainable? And what that seeks to do, what both of those will do, will also require a certain level of LEED certification for the buildings. Now that can change depending on the context, depending on the building typology, but what they do is they recognize that one single LEED classification may not be applicable to all buildings. In our research process, we found that LEED Platinum can be a little more common in office buildings. It can also be very common in government buildings or publicly financially backed housing developments. It's not very common at all in private market housing developments for a number of different reasons. Some of it is cost, some of it is the ability to incorporate some of these features, and it may not be something that we would always be able to achieve or every development may be able to achieve. One of the other programs essentially we found was eco districts. And this is really looking at things through the lens of 3 different imperatives. equity, resilience, and climate protection. And what this does, as well as the lead cities and lead for neighborhood development, is also really cues us up for the climate action plan that our city will ultimately have to produce. So again, it's looking at sustainability in a more holistic fashion. Eco districts is not LEED. It's another form of sustainability. It's another form of certification that we can pursue, one that we could go and study further if council directed us. It really focuses on 6 priorities. And again, this is looking beyond just the building sustainability, just environmental sustainability. That is a feature of it, that is an element of it, but it's also looking at place, it's looking at health and well-being, connectivity, living structure, infrastructure, and what we mean by that is vegetation. Is the district, is the neighborhood incorporating enough green to be sustainable? So there are a number of different features, a number of different elements. And through our review, what we found is that either the lead cities or lead neighborhood development or the eco districts may be one of the more comprehensive approaches to sustainability versus focusing solely on individual buildings, which may not always be able to achieve, whether that's financial or just technical requirements of LEED Platinum. So again, kind of pros and cons. LEED Platinum is, that's the optimal that we can achieve for buildings. That's the most sustainable we're going to get for an individual building. But again, it's not fit for all buildings. It could be cost prohibitive. And it's also not looking at that kind of broader community strategy. And in this case, when we say community, we're really focused on the downtown specific plan area. Again, we can pursue a designation, we can pursue strategies for just a designated area in addition to just looking at the buildings. The lead cities and the eco districts, and this is what staff would recommend studying in greater depth, as this goes for a more comprehensive analysis of sustainability. It goes for more comprehensive requirements. Essentially, this would function as an overlay. We would put this over our zoning and our requirements within the downtown specific plan. Any project looking to pursue development within those boundaries would have to meet these requirements and these priorities that we would set forth as part of this. Again, broader sustainability initiative, this really cues us up for our ability to produce a climate action plan as well, which is something that is on our near horizon that we will have to do as a city.
Mayor, may I ask a question?
I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Mrs. Devine, may I ask a question?
Yes, please, Ms. Devine.
Thank you. Bradley, in our DSP, we mandate silver LEED, correct?
We do not mandate silver LEED. The building code is essentially caught up to that level. We currently don't have a mandate for individual sustainability for a building.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure that whatever route we go, that we're not going to be downgrading our LEED requirements or our LEED asks. That's my fear, that's what's going to happen with either of these programs. Am I right or wrong? Or
regardless of which program we chose, it would be a step up in terms of sustainability. So really the question is for council is do we want to look at it just on the individual building scale, which would be new developments that come in the door, or do we want to look at it in a broader sense, which would still include the individual buildings, but do we want to kind of capture more as part of that sustainability initiative with downtown?
all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a point of clarification?
Yes, please.
There. So we're going to go through each of these and discuss them. Otherwise, I have some comments on this, but should I wait? Are we going to go through the checklist?
I think the idea is to go through the entire presentation because we have speakers and otherwise. So
Okay, then
that
we'll
way
go
you can
through the
through a
checklist and then we can
presentation.
discuss it.
Correct.
Good. That's what I.
Thank you.
Got it.
So the next additional consideration is transfer of development rights. This was something that came up in conversation during some of the review process of some of the projects, also when we were amending the downtown specific plan. Essentially, the way this works is that one parcel can transfer its development rights to another. The first example that we're showing here is common ownership transfer. And when we use this example, the Sears location may be a good site as an example, is that you have two separate, essentially distinct parcels that are separated by a street. They're not connected. And the idea behind this is that if we had a transfer of development rights program in place, is that if that property were redeveloped, rather than them developing the automotive site independently, that they could take that development potential and move that over to the larger site, provided that they gave some sort of community benefit that the council and the city could direct them to give. A park would be a good example. Essentially, it's allowing them to move whatever could be built. If you look at diagram on the second one there to the right, it's moving that light blue box that you see in the first one to the left on top. So that property would exceed its currently allowed usage or density, allowable density, but combined together it does not. Essentially, you're moving density from one site to another to create an opportunity for, in this case, it could be a park.
I have a problem with the idea because then site B should be should not be separated from site A, or property B should not be separated from property A, because I have a feeling that they're gonna move to the site A, let's say, and years later they're gonna sell the site B. How you can stop them unless it should be we will run with the deed? Or
We would
how
have a
it's gonna-
covenant in place. This is much like any of the open spaces that would be required for other developments, the corner plazas, things of that nature. That carries. If that property changes hands, they still have to provide that open space. They can't go back and take that away. That's something that could be developed as part of the program, those restrictions and those requirements, but it would have a covenant. Typically, these have a covenant, because you don't want somebody coming back years later and tearing that down and redeveloping just because it changed ownership.
Okay, it will be in the deed.
Correct.
Covenant in the deed. All right.
A second example of this would essentially be a private market or private property that is not in common ownership, actually would be a better term. And essentially, if you had a site B that did not meet its full development potential, they would have the opportunity to sell what they didn't use to another property owner for them to be able to add that to their development potential. Again, that will come with the covenant. It will come with a requirement that site B cannot come back later on and add those 2 stories that I removed. They can't go back and exceed that density that they're at that moment in time.
Okay, one more question, I'm sorry. And then, should it be mention a distance, that how far the other property should be from site A? Because I may buy something somewhere else and say, okay, I'm not gonna build anything there, but I will move this.
And that's a good question, and that came up during some of our other discussions, is that we don't want this to be a program that is used citywide. It would just be in the downtown specific plan. Council, if this is something you wanted to move forward with, you could also put additional restrictions on it, saying that properties need to be within such a proximity of one another, or you don't want them in proximity of, say, transition zones. You don't want someone to move all of their density from Brand over to Central right against multifamily. Restrictions could be put in place saying we will only allow this much transfer, or we won't allow it at all in certain districts. That's something that we would need to go back and study per any direction that we get from council today.
Yeah, that's what I think we have to consider, like Sears building, there is just adjacent to the larger lot.
Mhm.
I mean, it's very close. I can imagine something like this, but I don't know how my council members are thinking about this or what they have in their mind. I don't want from a distance to say, okay, I'm not gonna develop this one, which is a cheaper lot, and I will put it on the expensive one. That can happen too, right?
And what I would say is that if this is a program that council wish to pursue and study, again, those different requirements can be put in place, but it also doesn't mean just because we put this in place that anyone outright can just do it. Cities like Los Angeles, other cities, they have an application process requirement, so it's something that they would apply for. We would determine that was something that we could bring back to council. Does council wish to approve this transfer of development rights? So it can be looked at on a case-by-case basis, provided that there was a clear set of guidelines, directions, restrictions set up for it.
Right, that raises a question for me. Is there similar idea in any other cities?
Yes, in fact, Burbank, Pasadena, and Los Angeles all have a transfer of development rights. In some of them, especially in cities like Pasadena, it's really for historic preservation.
But how far they allow to move from one property, the rights on one property to the next one?
That would be part of our study. If council wanted us to look at this in greater detail and to start developing a program, we would look at those other cities and see, do they have certain proximity rules? Do they have certain district restrictions, limitations, things like that?
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
So the same principle also applies to potentially historic resources. Site B, maybe that's a potentially historic resource, but they could build something on that site. Maybe they could add something on top of it. Maybe they are able to tear that site down after they've gone through proper CEQA analysis. If we really want to try to encourage preserving some of these, you can allow that development potential that's on that site to be transferred over to another, and then that allows that historic resource to stay in place. And that's really the intent behind, say, Pasadena's, for example, is that it's really trying to preserve some of the older buildings, some of the older characters, so that buildings don't get torn down or built on top of or built too closely. 340's North Central could be a perfect example of where something like this could work well. The ability for them to maybe build something at a smaller scale, but sell off the rest of those rights that they were not able to use, or council expressed a disinterest in them using, to another property owner. It ensures that their property is still financially feasible, if you will. So ultimately, the question that we would be asking as part of this is, if council wants to have staff study a transfer development rights program, if so, do you want to limit it to common property ownership, or do you want to explore beyond that? Again, not a policy decision. It's more of which features of this do you want us to study? What are the things that you want us to incorporate into it as we study it? The next part is dwelling units per acre versus FAR as a means to measure density. This is something that came into discussion last year during the amendment process. In fact, we had a separate meeting just for this. Ultimately, the decision was to maintain the FAR measurement, but council did ask to bring this back and have another discussion today, see if any feelings, opinions may have changed. What we can say is staff still does stand by the FAR density measurement. And this is because the dwelling unit per acre measurement is really focused more on a suburban, single-family, small garden apartment style development. It's where you're really trying to restrict the number of dwelling units that land on a site because you're trying to preserve maybe a single-family character or a more modest density. FAR is really meant for urban locations. It's pretty much a standard practice across the country. And what you can see in this diagram, just as an example, as you're moving kind of left to right, is how those dwelling units, when that designation is applied, how many can fit on site. What I'd like to call attention to, and one of the restrictions of the dwelling units per acre, is that it doesn't allow us to control for that mass and that scale. And that's really what we were trying to do with those DSP amendments last year, is to reduce mass, reduce scale, improve design. And dwelling unit per acre really just focuses on that number of units. And as you can see, as you move through there, depending on the size of the units, that mass can grow and it can change. Now, granted, there are some development standards in place that help us kind of control that, but when it's measured through FAR, it really allows us to shape and mold that density into whatever form council sees fit, the community sees fit as part of our development standards. It gives us a little bit more of that flexibility to control what that box looks like. So if we wanted to see a shorter, more squat box, as you see in image number 3, or if council, much like we did when we raised the building heights in the Orange Central District and Broadway Center A, wanted to see something more slender, more narrow to free up some of that land on the ground level for publicly accessible open space. What it also does is it creates a little bit of flexibility in the unit count. Again, when you say dwelling units per acre, you're saying, if it's 12 units per acre, you're only allowing 12 units. That's it. That's the rule. That's how many can go there. But if we're looking at it from an FAR, again, it just needs to fit inside that box. And that FAR is a calculation, it's a function of the site area. So if it's 100,000 square feet and the FAR is 2, that means 200,000 square feet can go on that site, but it has to fit inside that box. Whether it's a short, stout box or if it's a tall, slender, narrow box. So it doesn't control necessarily how many units can actually go into that floor plate maybe. But it does give us flexibility, especially now that we're looking at our affordable housing crisis. This gives us an opportunity, maybe a floor plate can squeeze an extra unit or two out of it by tinkering with some of the unit sizes. And that's kind of what we just wanted to illustrate here is, again, that FAR gives us that flexibility we need to address some of those issues, whether it's design and aesthetics or trying to get things like the diverse housing unit mix that we have that requirement for in the DSP for any project pursuing that kind of higher level of intensity. So really the question on this one is, council want to maintain that FAR density measurement or consider and study what the impacts of a dwelling unit per acre measurement would be on downtown?
I have a question.
Yes, Mr. Broad.
Could we have both? Could we have both measures? And, because I understand a lot of cities do both. Is that true? Pasadena, LA?
They do.
Let's see, LA, West Hollywood, Santa Monica, all kind of have both. You have to meet both conditions. So you have a maximum dwelling units and you have an FAR that you're working with?
In theory, yes, you can. It makes it a little bit harder to control design, that massing, that box, to get a kind of high-quality result, because it's what we refer to as a form-based code, if you will, or a hybrid version of it. And that's what allows us to kind of control and improve that larger box. The dwelling unit per acre starts adding in another layer. With that being said, as a city, we do have both. Downtown is FAR, pretty much everywhere else is dwelling units per acre. The other thing that we do as part of that, the downtown specific plan and that tier community benefit is, in a way, we've kind of put a little bit of an overlay of that on there, because we have a certain requirement that says we need you to provide 20%, 30%, 40% 2 and 3 bedroom units. Also, you're maxed out at the number of studios that you can provide. So in a way, we do kind of do that, just with a little bit of flexibility in there, so that we can control for those design elements.
But we could layer both of them on if we want.
Potentially. It would be a challenge, but potentially.
But it's fairly common.
Yes and no. For an urban district, FAR is pretty much the guiding principle that's used.
But I understand, you know, Pasadena, West Hollywood, those are all urban. Santa Monica, all do it that way.
I have to take a look at that. I know that we all do have the conversion factor for affordable housing as well, that there is still that dwelling unit per acre, but we can look at the other cities and see.
Yeah,
how
that was
they've
the
done
other
it.
question that somebody wrote in a letter, is how do you determine how many affordable units there should be if you don't know the number of units, the number of dwelling units you're gonna have in that development? I'm not sure how that works.
And essentially, there's a conversion factor, there's a conversion table, if you will, that's provided to us to be able to calculate that. Stuck again. There we go. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Vilia Zematitis, and she's going to go through the rest of the additional considerations before we address some of the cleanups that need to be done.
All right, the remainder of the considerations relies solely on the zoning code, or in this case, the DSP standards. The item before you in terms of measurement of FAR. Currently, the residential standards omit indoor recreation rooms from the FAR calculation in a way to incentivize amenity spaces within an apartment building or within a condominium. That does not apply right now to the DSP, nor does it apply to other uses other than multifamily residential zone. So this is for council to consider whether or not you would like to also omit indoor recreation rooms for multifamily residential projects in the downtown, and possibly also expand that to include hotels. These would be smaller amenity areas such as gymnasium or indoor gyms, indoor rec rooms and whatnot. It would not be larger congregation spaces. So again, for your consideration, do you wish to omit these indoor recreational facilities from the FAR
So
calculations?
if we are, excuse me, if we are say yes, means we are not considering in the FAR calculation.
Correct. If you say yes, it would be not considering them as part of FAR.
Okay.
And if I may, I have a question on
Yes,
this.
please,
Also, I'd be
Mr. Rock.
interested in, do other cities do that? Do they exclude these amenities as part of their FAR?
There are a handful of cities that do exclude these because it is a way of incentivizing in recreation facilities on site, but it is not across the board.
Okay, that's something I'd like to know. Because I can't see why we would exclude them. I don't understand. Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I'd like to see whether there's a preponderance of other cities that do this and what their thinking is, and how it's worked out.
All right. Next item would be a publicly accessible open space. Previously, the downtown specific plan allowed for projects to receive additional incentives and bonuses in terms of FAR and height in exchange for providing publicly accessible open space. Those were actually covenanted to make sure that those publicly accessible open spaces remain so as in exchange for the additional FAR and height. This type of mechanism did not go forward in the recent DSP amendments, and staff is recommending that it be brought back to have covenants be required in order to maintain publicly accessible open space. And again, this is for council consideration, whether or not you wish to require these spaces to have a covenant to ensure that the space remain accessible and open to the public.
Excuse me, say what yes means and what no means.
So if you say yes, that means you would like to have covenants for publicly accessible open space.
Question.
Maybe it must-
These would be in
Councilor.
perpetuity?
These would be in perpetuity,
Okay.
correct? Next consideration would be drive-throughs in the downtown. The whole purpose of the downtown specific plan is to prioritize pedestrian experiences, walkability downtown. We've noted time and time again that drive-throughs are very car-heavy, vehicular-oriented type uses, and that they might not actually be conducive to a pedestrian walkable downtown. So at this point, it is up to City Council to decide whether or not you would like to prohibit drive-throughs whatsoever in the downtown specific plan. Again, also idling cars in a drive-through would also be counterintuitive to the climate action plan goals. So there are other cities that have them as conditional use permits required or prohibit them outright, but this again would be a yes would mean that you do not wish to see drive-throughs in the downtown and that we would be prohibiting them.
But that was recently, drive-throughs are saying creating so much smog because they're waiting and the car is running. There was issues about this, I guess cities or state, or California state was trying to bring to attention that in suburban areas, they don't want to have drive-throughs because of the cars are idling and they create lots of smog. I don't know if you're considering that or not.
We could look into that if that's something the state is considering. We have seen a number of cities nationwide start to do that, and it's on that exact premise, is that idling cars continue to emit more and more pollution, if you will.
Yeah.
And I would add to this, this does not mean that we would be getting rid of the existing ones. The existing ones would be allowed to stay in place, provided that they did not change, did not redevelop. It would be prohibiting any new drive-throughs from being implemented in downtown.
Okay, thank you.
Tandem parking, this was a point of discussion for a recent project that went before City Council. The DSP does allow for tandem parking up to 50% for residential uses. That tandem parking space is actually defined in our zoning code as being a non-accessible parking space. So you'll note in the slide, the cars in green are not accessible from a drive aisle. So those would be considered the tandem parking spaces. Those would be calculated as tandem. So up to 50% of the parking in a residential project can be considered tandem, provided that each matching space, the tandem and the accessible space, be for the same unit. In terms of commercial projects, up to 25% of the parking can be considered tandem. Again, up for council's consideration is, do you wish to study modifying?
I'm sorry, when you say commercial means if office building is considered commercial?
Correct. An office building, a medical office building.
Condominium?
No, well, it depends on what type of condominium. If it's a residential condominium, then no, it would be the same under residential, for any type of residential use. We do have commercial condominiums that, in that case, the underlying use, which would be the commercial use, would then apply for up to 25%.
Apartment building?
50% can be up to 50% can be tandem, provided the same matching tandem and accessible space are per unit.
All right, thank you.
I have a question. You know, back to aside from the policy discussion, I just have a problem with the definition. When I voted for, way back, permit 50% of the residential parking to be tandem, in my mind, 50% meant that half the cars would have individual parking spots, the other half would be doubled up, which is wrong. Correct? That's a wrong definition. That would be a 33% tandem. And by our definition here, there's no way that you could have 100% tandem. To me, 100% tandem means all the cars are in a double parking configuration. By our definition, so the 100% is an impossibility. It's like the empty set. Divide something by 0. It does not compute. So it's extremely misleading to council, who will, for the lack of their planning experience, relies on the common use of the percent term when we make our decisions. So maximum 50%. If I've got a building that needs 100 parking spots, if we say a maximum of 50%, that means that all those spots can be doubled up, correct?
Yes.
In a two-car configuration.
Yes, Councilman.
So that makes no sense to me. If I had to vote on this over again, I would have slashed my decisions by half, because that's what I understand now the true meaning of the term of a tandem spot is. So I just want to put that out there. And that was raised with the 340 North Central, where they had 25%. So 25% tandem means that half the cars in that lot are in the back-to-back configuration. So that's a problem I think we need to clean up one way or the other. Either state the term to be 100%, or let's reduce the number of cars in that tandem configuration to actually reflect what the common understanding of the term 50%.
But do you have problem with have a parking lot, but that half of it is blocked, half of it is open to get out?
Well, there's different factors involved. That is that type of tandem configuration going to inhibit people from parking in that? Or will they look for spots out on the street or in their neighborhood, be saying, oh man, if I park here, Joe's gonna park in front of me, and if I leave, then I'm gonna have to get Joe to move his car. Forget it, I'm just gonna park in front of this apartment building and get it done. So for me, that's the problem. Is that in the real practical experience of tandem parking, there's certainly discouraged to first car in there, because you're gonna be blocked in. You're gonna need someone to do that. If we had tandem parking for city council, I guarantee you, we would be looking at other things, because you have to run off to do your show, I have to run off for another meeting, and, I don't want to be the guy parked in there. I don't want to find Verej and say, Verej, move your car, or trust a operator, owner, to run a valet service, which will never be able to monitor and to enforce, which was another issue with the 340 building. They were talking about, well, they're going to have a valet service.
But
Well,
what happened with the definition to stay, and we say they can't have more than 25%? Like
well,
that?
that's the other, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, is let's either revisit that, or, it's just a very non-intuitive definition of the parking, of the number of cars that will be tandem parked. Maybe you planners, you grew up on this, Planning 101, but for an average person, it's very, I don't want to go on with it, but it's very,
Yeah,
it's non-intuitive.
all right, thank you. Let's go.
As a side note to the tandem parking issue, it would be also bicycle parking. Bicycle parking in the DSP, you can essentially offset required parking by providing on-site bicycle parking at a ratio of 1 parking space for every 5 bicycle parking spaces. And the DSP allows us to reduce, or allows a project to reduce the overall parking count by up to 10%. So again, this would be for council's consideration. Would you like to modify this standard as well?
And let me ask a question.
Yes.
Again, this might be a term of art for planners, but not for lay people. When you say bicycle parking, what does bicycle parking mean? Is it just a square footage of area? Or is it the amenities including a lock or a chain or a locker or different things like that, which, so
Councilmember.
is that a term of art? Did I miss that in Planning 101 also, or?
No,
Because
Councilmember.
what does it
Nazar.
mean? What does it mean?
No, it would essentially be a permanent long-term. There's a definition in our code that relies on short-term parking, which would be essentially one of those type of features or that you would actually lock your bike next to, and then long-term meaning an actual locker with a lock.
I want to hear from the Bicycle Coalition, because they will be the ones most likely using it. I'm not a frequent biker, so, I mean, this is for another
Sorry.
time. I mean, it'll come back to us, but I'd like to understand what sort of amenities, the range of amenities would be for bicycle parking.
And how many, we consider, how many bicycle or motorcycle we can park in one, I'm sorry, 1 second, Ms. Devine. How
Okay,
many
that's my question.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Devine.
Oh, well, I think I was gonna ask the same, thank you, Mr. Mayor, the same question is, one parking space equals how many bikes? Parking for how many bicycles?
One parking space can be replaced with 5 long-term bicycle spaces.
Right. So if you do the calculations, that's a lot of bicycles. If you remove, let's say, 30 parking spaces, you're making room for 150 bikes. Think about that. I don't think it makes sense. I'm just saying.
It depends how many you remove, I guess. You're
Correct.
right, your math is correct, it's just a matter of how many the
Right,
owner
well,
wants.
10% of 300, what, let's say 10% of 150. Let's say you need 150, that's 10 parking spaces, right? That would be 50 bikes. Come on.
An option
you,
that
Nick.
council could consider is putting a cap on it. If you wanted to keep the percentage, you could just say up to a certain number of bicycle spaces. If you're trying to kind of set a threshold, it would still be a conversion of, percentage like we have, but you could cap that number at a certain point so that you didn't have a 700 space parking garage convert 10% of it into, several dozen parking spaces, several hundred potentially.
Right.
And a max
That
fee.
makes more
And
sense.
that's not motorcycles.
No, that would not be motorcycles.
Is
This
it
is bicycle.
e-bikes?
No, it would be actual
Non-motorized?
non-motorized bicycles.
Bicycle.
If I could just follow on that?
Mr.
Just to
Ross.
clarify, you said, so it's a locker. Can you explain what the concept is?
Typically, they'll have one of those type of cages. So
Oh,
they'll either
okay.
have a larger cage that can actually have hanging bicycles or individual cages where you can actually lock up your
Okay.
bike.
So it could take an e-bike. I mean, size-wise, there's no difference.
It is meant for non-motorized bicycles, human-powered, so.
But in the real world, you'll put in whatever. I mean, e-bikes are becoming much more popular, so there's no reason why you wouldn't want it to be.
Correct. You can use it as an e-bike. To
Not
continue,
gasoline powered. Non-thermal,
No, e-bikes, you plug them in.
I know, but there's also bikes
Well,
with
that's a
motor.
motorcycle. That's then a moped or one of those things.
to continue, the next consideration would be retail frontages. Certain streets such as Brand Boulevard and Artsock Street have a prohibition from certain type uses, or essentially a recommendation that active retail uses and active restaurant uses be provided on the ground floor. We've had a number of applications come in recently for medical office or gymnasiums. Those can only go in when you have the first 25 feet be provided as an active retail. So sometimes a gym will sell activewear or whatnot. That would be consistent with our code, but this again, offices and medical uses would not be allowed within the first 25 feet along Brand Boulevard and Artsock in a way to incentivize an active storefront system. In this case, the design requirements and restrictions could be enhanced. non-active uses such as those medical offices and office-type uses that are not active be prohibited, or you can just go ahead and maintain the current requirement with no change. So this would be for council to decide, how would you like to proceed? Would you like enhanced design requirements? Would you outright prohibit all type uses, whether it's medical or professional office on the ground floor? Or would you like to maintain the current requirement, meaning the first 25 feet along these streets have to be active type retail or restaurant uses, and the remainder can be whether it's medical or professional office or whatnot? So,
Question?
Yes,
We're talking
Mr.
about
Major.
25 feet of horizontal distance, not a second floor. Or
Yeah.
does that second floor include also?
thank you, Councilmember Najarian. This would only apply for ground floor units, and this would be the first 25 feet in depth.
In depth.
So,
So is this perhaps using Massage Envy? They've got their lobby with a lot of retail products, whatever, lotions, potions, shirts and all that. But then the business end of it, of the massages, bad example, are in the 25 feet further. Is that an example of what?
that is a very good,
Like
bad example.
optometrists, they've got their retail glasses up front, but the eye exam and stuff is.
Correct.
So, if I could, Mr. Mayor? Mayor
Yeah,
Argajon?
Mr. Broad.
Just want to continue on
No
that.
problem.
Yeah, because I want to, I had the same question. So right now, we would allow what Councilmember Najarian was describing, right? We would allow them to put like the glasses and the other things and have the medical facility behind it. You're saying the question before us is whether we would want to just prohibit that use altogether?
Yes, you can do status quo, which would be essentially
Where they
require.
can continue to do these kinds of, a little bit of a game there where you have your retail business up in front for the first 25 feet.
Correct. Or you can also direct staff to come back with more stringent design requirements. So to really make those active storefronts engaging and inclusive within the streetscape. Because right now we do have the urban design guidelines for storefront systems, but to ensure that even these type of uses along Brand Boulevard and along Artsock be even more of a priority at the street frontage.
Right.
And if I can add a bit of context to that, one of the reasons why this came up is that essentially we had some applicants that would just mail in that first 25 feet. And we looked at that and we said either we need to tighten up our design restrictions or do something with the uses, because there isn't a whole lot that stops them if they design a retail store frontage and then they put a counter in front of there to basically have a pot of coffee and say, well, I sell coffee to somebody now. And that's not necessarily befitting of the character that we might be striving for on those streets. That's really what kind of invoked this conversation to begin with, is that we had people that just really weren't putting in the full faith and effort for something good. And do we want to either tighten up those requirements or just try to prohibit those uses altogether on those streets only?
So there's across from the Alex Theater, there's a very large law firm. I don't think fits the active use definition. Do we enforce that with code enforcement, or is there a grandfather?
That is currently a legal non-conforming use. The law office is across the street from.
It is
so
legal, but not.
It's legal non-conforming, so it is grandfathered in prior to the DSP standards.
Because I get it. I mean, you've got food and drinks and all this other stuff, and you've got boring, you've got this law firm, and then you've got, 85 degrees and halal guys and Starbucks and juice and all that. It does take, in my mind, it does take away from that certain sense of vigor that we're trying to bring to that very limited stretch of Brand and Artsock.
Thank you.
I have one more thing.
Councilmember Broad.
Another thing, do we have any rules on whether they're allowed to have these glazed windows? Because if you can't see in, then it's not going to bring the pedestrian into the space. And there's also those things, what are they called, shadow boxes, which is like a fake window, and then there's like just some display behind it?
Spandrel glass.
Yeah, so do we, what's that?
Spandrel glass?
Okay,
That's
over my
the
head.
term.
But-
Fake window,
A
basically.
fake
But
window.
can we kind of do something about those, or do we already prohibit things like that?
We do it in our urban design chapter. There are specifications that the transparency and the opaqueness be limited, that it be open storefront, and I believe Bradley would like to chime
When we did our street classifications, each of those streets recognizing how intense we may want to see activity, we set a certain percentage of transparency that had to be maintained. It was an effort to, one, minimize uses that we didn't want on there, two, to make sure that people didn't put storage and mechanical rooms and things like that facing out on the street to tuck those behind. So we do have that requirement in place. I believe it's 75% on most streets, if I'm not mistaken.
You mean 75% of the frontages have to be
Correct.
clear? Why wouldn't we just say they all have to be that way if these are our pedestrian areas?
A number of reasons, with exiting for fire egress, things like that. Sometimes you have to, in almost all occasions, you have to have some sort of egress out there that may not be transparent or cannot be transparent. Also understanding that there are columns that support the structure. If you're talking about a long facade of a building, every 40 feet, you're going to have somewhere between 2 and 5 feet in width that will have to be opaque. So that 75%, the 25% is accounting for those kind of requirements that we know are going to be in a building.
Okay, and that would include these kind of fake windows?
Correct.
Okay. So they're limited to 25%.
Correct. But most of that will be taken up by those kind of egress, those service things that might have to be there, or structural requirements.
I mean, for what it's worth, I'd like to limit that as much as we possibly can.
When we did research across other cities, that's about the maximum we can take it, especially when you're considering long facades, larger developments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's continue, please.
Next consideration would be design review stages. The stage 1, stage 2, and there are additional stages, came back from the Glendale Redevelopment Agency, where all Glendale redevelopment projects came before the agency. Now in City Council, with the abolishment of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency, all DSP projects come before the board. We've had a combination of projects that have either come before you either in stage 1, which is a conceptual review, or a combination of stage 1 and 2, which would be conceptual and final review. Again, this is at the risk of the developer, whether or not they feel their project complies with the downtown specific plan standards and goals and feel confident in the design of their project. So what you see before you, you have 2 projects that actually were reviewed by City Council, one that was approved and one that was denied as a combined stage 1 and stage 2. So do you wish to allow developers to choose whether or not they would like to proceed with a 2-part review system, meaning stage 1 and stage 2 separately? Or would you allow projects, or would you prohibit the combination and have projects come before you in a 2-stage process?
So if we say yes, means the stage 1 comes first. It's not going to be on.
So if you say yes, you would allow projects to choose
Right.
to continue status quo.
Okay.
If you say
Status quo?
status quo, meaning currently they are allowed to either split stage 1 and stage 2
Okay.
or combined
Yeah.
stage 1 and 2.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, please,
Where
Mr.
do we spell out exactly what constitutes stage 1 and stage 2?
There were Glendale Redevelopment Agency guidelines that specified stage 1 being conceptual, stage 2 being final review, stage 3, I believe, is a plan check, and stage 4 would be inspections. And so those were clearly spelled out. In this case, it just essentially correlates. We do have in design review, for the design review board, they are allowed to do preliminary review or final review. So this
So
would
it's
be
in the-
consistent.
It's in, you're saying, redevelopment-related codes? Or?
It's not actually, it is, prior to this, it was spelled out in the Glendale Redevelopment Agency or guidelines. In this case, we have the design review board authority for DSP projects is the council, and you can choose whether or not you come before as a preliminary conceptual review or as a final.
So could we clean that up? Could we put those clearly into this ordinance?
Yes?
Or because I think it would be good that we're as clear as possible on what those stages, include.
We can definitely clarify that when given direction by a council, how you wish to proceed, whether you would still allow for a two-step process and a combined stage 1 and 2, and we can
Okay.
clarify that in our zoning code.
Okay.
Next item would be going back to last March 2019 discussion. This was for the streamlining of design review board. There was an option, and I apologize, I misspoke. In this case, this is the option of having the design review authority remain the city council and having the design review board be a recommendation prior to city council review. This was brought up in a previous review stage where the city council, certain members, the newer board members actually, have requested that the projects go before the design review prior to coming to city council. Previously, with the DSP update, that was clearly decided upon that city council would remain the only and final design review. So when we last went through the DSP updates back in March of last year, city council voted to have it only be the city council review. So again, it's brought back before you. Do you wish to change that and modify that now? Or do you wish to continue with city council being the only final authority? There is also another option where you, if you so wish, you can omit review altogether from the city council review and go solely to the design review board. And this was done for the San Fernando Road Corridor Redevelopment Agency areas. So previously, projects in the San Fernando Road Corridor went before city council, and city council decided to remand that authority back to the DRB. And so projects in the San Fernando Road Corridor are now heard by the
Are you
DRB.
talking about consider yielding DSP design review projects through city council? So yes and no, what they mean?
So under your checklist item for design review authority for DSP projects, yes would be yes, require DRB review and recommendation for DSP projects prior to city council review. No would be bypassing
Now, which one you are
DRB.
referring to? There are two items they look alike. Which one you are referring to?
So on your checklist item, the very top item, where it says design review authority for DSP projects, that is what we are
Design.
discussing now.
Second item.
So this would be just the authority for the DSP projects.
You're correct. There are two questions there. The first
There
one
are
is
two questions,
asking,
that's what I'm saying. Which one we
Correct.
the first question is asking you, do you want the design review board to look at
Where
these
it says,
projects?
do you want? I don't see it. Require
Option one.
DRB review and recommendation for DSP
Exactly.
project prior to council's review.
Correct.
So that would be the overarching question. Does council wish for the DRB to review these projects prior to coming to council?
Okay. And then the second one.
The second one is, would you prefer that the DRB be the sole body to look at the projects?
So if I say yes, means DRB will look at it. If I say no, it will come to city council.
If you say yes to number one, you would be saying that you would want
There
that
is
to
no
go.
number one, I'm talking
The first
about.
question, I'm sorry, the first question out of those two that you're asking?
No, I'm asking, consider yielding DSP design review projects through city council. If I say yes, means city council is not gonna get involved, DRB will.
Correct. That is
If
correct.
I say no, it will stay like now. It will
Correct.
come to us.
And you have that second question, the one that's before that, that's asking if you would like it to go to the DRB and then come to you. So you have two options there.
No, I understand. I just want on that one, the last one, which I said, I want to make clear because the sentence was not clear to me. The first one, I understand what it says. Okay, thank you.
So last year, during the permit streamlining process, the discussion of having alternate board members for the DRB came up. Now granted, this is not a DSP-specific issue that we're looking at, but it was something that council, a couple council members declared that they wanted to hear about this evening and maybe have some thoughts on. How do we want to allot those alternates? Originally, council said that they would like to have one alternate for each of the DRB members. We wanted to bring that back since we do have new council members on board now to see if that sentiment is still the same. Essentially, what we had proposed is that every design review board member would have one alternate, meaning each council member would appoint 2 members. The second alternative would be to have 2 alternates or 3 alternates or a reduced number. How those would be appointed would be, studied, researched, and decided. The pros and cons, we keep it equal, we keep it equitable in the first one, where every council member appoints 2 board members. The second one is really about maintaining that those alternates are always engaged and always involved. There's a little bit of concern that if we had essentially 10 DRB members, and if 1 or 2 of the original members never missed a meeting, then 2 alternates may not be engaged. So that was one of the considerations for having a reduced number of alternates. But again, council said 5 last time. The question is, do you want to keep that same composition or proposed composition, or would you like to consider the reduced number again?
And last but not least was the hotel incentive. Does council wish to conduct a study to find out whether or not hotel incentives is still necessary? So again, by right in the DSP, as long as you're a hotel, you are allowed to go to the maximum FAR and the maximum height for the district.
Now, what do we do now?
Don't need any.
What is at this time, are we considering that?
Right now,
hotels
they're a
as
community benefit, so they get extra height
Okay.
and all that other
All
stuff
right,
as a hotel.
And there are miscellaneous cleanups that staff is recommending be changed and corrected in the DSP. First being building heights, commercial zones allow for elevators and stairs to project above height. This would only be for elevators and stairs, so we would like to make that consistent with the zoning code in the DSP. We would like to clarify in the tall building section that all the standards in the tall building section only apply to structures greater than 95 feet, and this would be consistent with certain DSP districts and the maximum height limits. And going back to one of the examples that Bradley showed earlier would be that tower step back would only be required for lots that have a width greater than 100 feet. So if it's a very narrow lot, you would not be required to provide that additional tower step back element. We would also like to clarify in terms of the modulation of height that the corner treatment is only one of 4 options, and that if you do choose the corner treatment, then you have to refer to the corner treatment section that's later in the urban design chapter. And yes, Mayor Agajanian, I see you have a question.
no, I'm just wondering, you didn't ask it's not part of this questionnaire?
No, this is not part of the questionnaire. These are just miscellaneous cleanups that staff is recommending be corrected, and it would be up to the city council to essentially support staff's recommendations for these cleanups or to perhaps amend it in some other fashion. Just to continue building separation, we would need to correlate the text with the image. There's transitional massing standards, and we'd like to clarify that only applies when a property is directly adjacent to a multifamily residential zone. These would be for the properties along Central that are abutting the R1250 zone. We would like to clarify in the corner section that you can make the treatment be in either direction, either a 10-foot height increase or a 10-foot height decrease to essentially provide visual interest to that corner element. We would also like to reconsider the balcony requirement. Currently, the code limits a maximum of 40% of all balconies be projecting from the building face. I do have a slide that sort of visually illustrates what we are trying to accomplish. But again, just to finish up this slide, and there are just some minor typos that would need to be cleaned up. This is going back to the balconies. Code was written that 40% be a maximum projection, and that there's also it's a standard for the maximum depth. We felt, looking at some of the multifamily residential projects, when you noticed either all the buildings, the balconies are either recessed or all of the buildings are projecting, and that doesn't add a lot of visual interest. And so we essentially put forth a requirement limiting the amount of projection. So the intended outcome would be to have play, visual interest, and not just a solid facade where the balconies are either all projecting or all recessed. Now, again, if
No,
you...
before, I have a question. Can you go back, please, on the
Yes.
picture? Okay, when it is recessed, I mean, when it extends outside the building parameter, so if somebody is on the balcony and they drop something, let's say on the second level, they drop something, and then if that's on a walkway, so it would be very dangerous. What do we do on that?
Mayor Gajanian, that is a very good question. Now, in the DSP, you are not allowed to project any balconies beyond, and the next slide actually illustrates it. None of the balconies can project past the property line. So the walkways are specifically a secure area for pedestrians because there was nothing above you. Previously, Public Works did allow some projection of balconies over a property line, and those were very limited, and that ability now has changed within the last few years.
So we are not allowing to
We are not allowed,
extend-
no more, no. So
Okay.
you do see some projects that were constructed, 5, 6 years ago that had projecting balconies, and that is no longer an option.
All right, thank you.
We know that was a comment that we received in a letter. We want to make that clear that what we're proposing to change here is not to allow them to project. If you could go back a slide. The middle image there. We know that was a concern. One of the developments downtown did that, projected over the sidewalk. And then we made that requirement to recess some of it. Now, that's not to say that if we want to change that requirement, that we want to go back to this second option here. Again, they would not be allowed over the sidewalk in any way whatsoever, whether they're projecting, recessed, partially recessed. Go to the next slide. What we found in this image to the left, not saying that this is the best solution or the end-all solution, is that we found that applicants were coming up with some very creative ways to design some of these balconies. We felt that what we wrote before was a little bit too rigid in saying that this percentage has to be this far recessed. And we want to come up with some language. We don't have it today. That's something we would bring back if council allowed us to move forward with that cleanup. We would come back with some language that would allow for that kind of creativity, if you will.
Thank you. Are you finished?
And that would be it. So the next steps of this, after we decide which ones to move forward with, is staff will go and study these. Again, we're not making final policy decisions today. We would study, we would bring those back in study sessions, very similar in fashion as we did with the DSP the first time. This would include going to the Planning Commission, public outreach, things of those nature.
Thank you. I just, I have a question that I raised before, so I want to bring it up again. On the dwelling units which we were discussing before per acre versus FAR, I just want to make sure for the affordable housing which we create, I was told it can be less than certain square footage. We have like the units which we have on, not on Sonora, yes, Sonora, actually behind my studio. We have 66 units, and on those 66 units, the unit itself is so large, so that's why we have 66 units. For the same building, but if we can make the living space smaller, then we're gonna have more units. We had, for that 66 units, we had 6,872 applicants, and this was the lowest. Previously, for 31 units, we have over 10,000 people came forward. They needed those units. For 31, we had over 10,000 applicants. So I visited that building many times because it's right next to me. People, they invite me, they used to invite me the very first days when this building being available. I've been inside the building. One person have such a space, or family of two. They have such a big space. In my opinion, rather than having 66 units, we could have 100 units. So that list of 6,870 some people who are looking for those apartments, they're gonna have a better chance. Now we are, pretty soon, probably we're gonna build this 500 units. So I wanna make sure that we can do this. I don't want later when they start doing this building, then say, oh, we can't have a unit which is less than 600 or 800 or whatever. Let's do whatever we have to do now. So when we get to that point, we're gonna have smaller units, but more units. So we'll accommodate more people.
This is only, remember, this is only in the downtown Pacific Plan area. Outside of the downtown is different standards.
But if by any chance we have affordable housing in downtown area, that can happen, right? It's possible.
Expensive, nothing's impossible.
Right. So this is the time that we have to raise the issue that later we're not going to say, oh, we can't do it, we have to wait until next year or year after. So maybe we look into it and see what we can do about it. I don't know if anybody want to comment on this, or we leave it for future.
Well, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, Bradley, do you want to touch on unit sizes, or Velia, whoever wants to touch on that? In terms of what's in the code today, which is the 600 square feet, you're accurate. It's not 600, go ahead.
If the discussion is just in downtown, then it's 540 square feet for a studio in downtown. If we're talking broader, if the affordable housing sites that you were discussing, that would be outside of downtown, and then that threshold is 600 square feet for a studio apartment. That's kind of the base minimum that a unit can be. And that's what, we try to illustrate here in terms of the FAR, is that's what gives us that little bit of flexibility, is that if some of those numbers change somewhere, remember in the DSP, we also have requirements for minimums on 2 and 3 bedroom square footages as well, that if we play with any of those, the point that you're making is that it starts to free up a little bit of room for maybe another unit or a smaller unit. So that's why staff believes that FAR is the best solution for downtown, and maybe even potentially just multifamily in general, is because it gives that flexibility that could be needed.
I just want to be on the record that I'm talking only about affordable housing. I'm not talking about anything else. Just affordable housing, I want to be able to make it smaller units.
The challenge with that is that we cannot discern between affordable and market rate. That would have to be a policy that we would have to make district or citywide, because we cannot break those out and have them have different standards than a market rate unit. They have to remain equal. So it would be something we would need to consider on a more broad basis in terms of unit size.
So when we're gonna go into this and make sure that we are doing something to change it, that affordable housing to be smaller than what it is, the standard is now, when we can discuss about that.
Well, again, we would need to look at it across all units. It can't be just affordable. It would have to be all residential units in general, multifamily units. If that is something that council wish for us to pursue and to look at and study, once we receive that direction, we could do that.
Okay, somebody explain to me why we can't do only for affordable housing. What's the reason? For affordable housing, we donate the land practically and some money, and we can't have control over it.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we'd have to look at some of the legal issues with that. It might be permissible. I think it's more you want to look at it in concept of your overall policy. Is it wise public policy to have affordable housing units treated differently than market rate units over the long term? And I think that's the policy discussion that Mr. Calvert is referring to. And from a legal perspective, we'd have to look at it. I'm not sure it's necessarily prohibited, but it does raise some challenges. But again, we need to hear from council that you want us to look at it, and if we get to review indicating you do, that'll be part of the discussion that Mr. Calvert and his team will go back and look at.
Yes, please.
Just a question, I just want to make sure I'm
Councilmember
understanding
Brad.
this. You're talking about being more flexible on the minimum unit, the minimum square footage for a
Right.
unit, so that we could go below 600 or whatever it
Right.
is, 540, you're saying in the downtown. What
Or
would be,
even 500.
yeah, what would be the reason why we wouldn't allow smaller units? I mean, what's the thinking in city planning about why you put in these types of requirements?
There's no particular reason not to. That's a requirement that's just already been in place for us. If you were to look at something like a studio unit, industry average is around 500 square feet nationwide. A lot of places go down as small as 450 for a studio apartment. As stated, outside of downtown, we're at 600, downtown, we're 540. So that is something staff would definitely be receptive of looking at. That was just a requirement that was already in place.
I mean, from my perspective, you know, we want more dwelling space, so, or dwelling units, you know.
Yeah, we
so-
can accommodate more people. I mean, this
So-
list is getting larger and larger
Yeah.
day by day, so what?
And
we
in the
gonna
urban
do?
center, there is, I think, a movement towards, you know, these micro units. So I don't see why we would prohibit it if there's a market for it, if a developer wants to build it and sees a market for that. I
Excuse
don't,
me.
unless there's something I don't understand, it seems to
I
me
mean, I
like.
just want to say, we are helping the people. We can't decide that this is affordable housing. We can't decide for them to be in smaller unit, especially all these affordable housing units. They have such a space for gathering, and most of the time, they spend their time playing games, or they're with other, what they call this, not movie, but TV rooms and other spaces for sport or whatever. They're big lots. Even the one behind me, there is big space that they can spend their time on, you know, in the lot, on downstairs. They spend their time there, and they just go in their room. Most of them, especially when they are alone, they go inside the room to sleep. They spend very little time in their unit. Why it can't be smaller and accommodate more people? That's what I'm wondering, Mr. Councilmember Najarian.
Well, I hate to bring up the past, but there was an atrocity of a development called the Elevate. I think it's called the Elevate. Is it still the name, or did they change it
I believe that's
to make it sound more spacious? That had units, if I'm not mistaken, 340 square feet. You guys, that was an abomination. I voted against that, as well as many other developments. But that one in particular was incredibly obnoxious. Now, I understand, in certain municipalities and urban areas, the micro units are encouraged. Maybe Asia, maybe in dense New York City type, but
Los Angeles?
certain parts of Los Angeles, perhaps,
I was
but
just told there are these 350 square feet bachelor apartments in LA.
okay. Glendale is not Los Angeles, and I hope we never become Los Angeles. I think we've got to have a basic size, so I'm not in favor of dropping it down from, what's our current, 500?
540.
540. I mean, to get below that, it turns into a glorified frat house, and that's what I called that building. I still stick to that. I don't think a building like that could ever be built again in Glendale in light of our inclusionary zoning and the mix of two-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units that we put in. But to get below 500, come on, that's a closet.
Okay,
You
500
lose your
is-
dignity. You lose your dignity living in a
Well, all right,
place.
500 is
something?
acceptable to you, Councilmember Najarian?
Well, so it's a bigger question about,
We want to give
I'd like to
direction.
discuss that. I'm not sure now is now the appropriate time to discuss minimum. But you're talking
It is-
citywide, or you're talking just DSP?
No, I'm talking about affordable housing. Any affordable unit, whether we're doing DSP, I'm talking only affordable units that we pay for the land. I'm not talking about contractors or whoever, developers. I'm talking about
mean, I would-
when
I
we
would
are
just-
involved.
I would know you have a number of different types of affordable units, not just ones where the city has assisted with the land. You would have density bonus units, inclusionary units, units that might be assisted through other entities. So you're gonna, whatever policy you're gonna craft is gonna have to apply across the board and not just the ones that we may assist through land donation.
So I guess the question is now the appropriate time to give direction, or should this be a separate agenda item in the future
Yeah.
to discuss the
Or
general
maybe you
question?
want to bring.
I think
things
either way,
forward.
we want to know if that's something you want the staff to study further.
We can break that apart for what would be applicable to downtown if downtown were treated differently from the rest of the city. It's similar to how we've approached the design review. We've added a few topics in there, not specific to downtown. One thing I would add to this in the question earlier, is there a reason why we wouldn't want very small units? It was council direction last year, though, to mandate, require that a mix of units be 2 and 3 bedrooms on the premise of creating more multi-generational households, more household opportunities for a mix of different households. As part of that, we did put in a maximum percentage requirement for studios as well. With that being said, there was that desire to have that mix of units. It doesn't mean that, toying with the square footage or studying that is not applicable. I think one thing that, from a planning perspective, of going down to a micro level unit is probably not an optimal idea. We haven't heard the greatest things about Elevate. If you look at most Urban Land Institute research studies on this as well, they don't perform very successfully unless they are in a Seattle, San Francisco, kind of New York City, very dense urban environment. So trying to find a middle ground is what that study would be. Where is that right number? Are we too large? Is that too small? What is a good place for us to land?
Okay, can we study that? Is this something we have to decide, or?
It's nothing
what
that
is
you
it?
have to decide today. It's just
Oh.
giving us direction to look at it, and then bring information back to the city council.
Councilmember.
Yeah,
Broad-
I would like to look at that, and, to Councilmember Najarian's point, I think it's more dignified to have 350 square feet than to be under a freeway overpass. So I think that we want housing for people. And I think if there's a market for micro units, I don't see why we should stand in the way.
I mean, if we're talking homeless housing, that's another discussion. Transitional housing, different. My opinion on that size differs. If Essentia came in and said, we can build 350 square foot units, I would look at that much differently than market rate units or, anyway, I mean, I would not object to a continuing discussion.
Likewise,
Thank you.
I would vote for that.
Mayor, I do have 3 callers on the line.
Oh, okay, let's go to the callers.
Monica, you're on the air. Monica?
Thank you very much, Mayor, council members, the staff. I've been listening to the presentation by staff. I'm a Glendale resident, member of the Glendale Environmental Coalition, and I'm calling in with 2 points of input for discussion.
I can't hear her.
Monica, can you get closer to the microphone? Monica?
Oh, yes, I can. I'm sorry.
Or go off speaker.
There we go. Sorry about that. My phone was on so long, it was heating up. Yes, I'm calling in today with 2 points of input from the Glendale Environmental Coalition regarding new building requirements that we hope you will consider. And they are less regarding aesthetic elements of the design and density, and more regarding the performance and sustainability aspects. The eco-district overlay zone is intriguing and worthy of consideration, but we do have several suggestions of things that we think should be required for new construction, no matter where that building is located. And these suggestions are aimed at reducing Glendale's carbon emissions in alignment with our forthcoming carbon action plan. My GEC colleague, Elise Kalfayan, will also be calling in with a few additional points. I have 2. One is, please consider an ordinance requiring solar and battery storage on all new construction of high-rise residential, that's over 3 stories, commercial, industrial. The City of Los Angeles is looking to adopt a REACH code by the end of the 3rd quarter of this year, so they have done a very good staff report looking at solar ordinance options. GEC plans to submit that staff report along with the proposal for Glendale shortly. Our proposal is being created in conjunction with Sierra Club staff, who helped craft the San Francisco ordinance. We also hope to include input from the LA Business Council, who are very supportive of measures like these and who provide good input from their developer business point of view. And number two, please consider requiring adequate space in multifamily residential and commercial buildings for all the different waste bins that are needed to be picked up by the hauler. And this may be good to think about when you come into your discussion later this evening. That includes recycling, food recycling, and green waste, as well as the commercial food buildings. Please consider the space needed for food waste collection, and consider the space needed for on-site dehydrators or digesters for commercial restaurants and other commercial buildings that generate a lot of food waste. You may want to consider this because more materials processed on site will mean less trucks, less carbon emissions. Managing things like this in this way is probably cheaper for businesses than paying for the hauling fees as well. Thank you, Council and staff, very much for your consideration, and have a good evening.
Still on?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it was very muffled. We couldn't hear it. Monica, could you mail in maybe, send an email with your words so that we can all have them?
Absolutely, and I don't know why that is, but I am happy to do that. I'll do that right this second. Thank you so much.
Yes, because I was having a hard time to understand what she was saying.
Yeah.
Monica, sorry, but I didn't get what you said. So if you email us, maybe we'll review it with my colleagues.
Yes, Mayor, I'm happy to do that right now, and I apologize. I don't know why that is, but I'm happy to do that right
It's
this
our
moment.
new system. It's not your fault. These are basically our new system. Okay. Thank
I will
you.
send that right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Do we have another call? Yes, go ahead.
Next caller, Ms. Kalfayan. You're on the air. Ms. Kalfayan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you?
And can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, yes, I'm Elise Kalfayan, a resident of Glendale and a member of the Glendale Environmental Coalition, and I really appreciate the discussion about sustainability, resilience, the climate action plan, and considering eco-districts as well. I'd ask that you consider ordinances for new construction that encourage electrification, including solar hot water heating and electric heat pumps, and requiring new buildings to be all electric ready. And maybe that is part of the lead cities and eco districts, but just requiring that across the board would be great. Also, with respect to parking, considering requiring parking spaces to be spaced in a way that accommodates solar carport structures where possible, where that's part of the construction and there's going to be like multiple levels of parking. Definitely EV charging stations in those parking lots. And also consider requiring landscaping that considers rainwater retention, bioswales and water capture, and water recycling systems. Something that reflects the beautiful materials and plants that were installed around the library, the downtown central library. So I encourage that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Catherine, you're on the air. Catherine?
Hi, thank you. This is Catherine Yurka. Hello, Mayor and Council members. I'm calling on behalf of the Verdugo Woodlands West Homeowners Association because we feel that all Glendale residents have a stake in our downtown. We sent you a letter, and we wanted to reiterate that we strongly support increased sustainability. And we, in fact, would like you to make, if possible, one policy decision today. And that is that while staff figure out what increased sustainability looks like based on your direction, that you suspend the mobility improvements as a community benefit right now. As we mentioned in our letter, the project at 620 North Brand, which is zoned at 275 feet, but is going up to 350 feet and could actually have gone 30 feet higher, unlocked something like a 25% height increase by providing, as we calculated it, 7 shared bikes, 3 spaces for shared cars, and 35 monthly transit passes. and this is for their 348 units. We find this completely outrageous. Last year, heights were increased in the Broadway Central Area A and Orange Central. Maximum development potential there takes a building that is 95 feet to 245 feet. So remember, a developer could almost triple the height of the building with a few shared bikes, shared car spaces, and monthly passes. We need to make sustainability a real community benefit and not a joke. We reiterate, please, our desire to have projects go to Design Review Board first and to the Planning Commission when variances are requested, not the planning hearing officer. All the community stakeholders at the meeting to discuss DSP revisions in 2018 supported doing this. California's affordable housing laws unlock a potentially unlimited number of variances, and it's just worth having the Planning Commission, which has excellent people on it, review these plans. But council should still have final review authority since these buildings in the downtown are so important. Please support transfer of development rights for historic resources, and that would have to be for properties with multiple owners. And also, we ask that you end the community benefit provision for hotels. We do understand the benefits of the hotel tax, but enough is enough. Thank you very much for your time, and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
No more callers.
No more calls. Thank you. Okay, on this item, I guess we are done with item number 1. Am I right, Mr. Garcia?
No, I think at this point, we're seeking direction on the checklist.
Yeah, I have.
Oh, on the checklist?
I can go through my comments on the checklist, but would you like us to go one by one and hear from all of us?
Or maybe we turn it in?
No, we
No?
can't do that, no.
Oh.
We need, on each item, I would take each item
Okay.
and seek council input on each of the items.
Would you like Mayor to
Yes.
go
Would you
through all
start?
of them,
Yeah.
or
Read from top?
from top to bottom?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, what do you mean?
All right, you guys ready? There are a lot of them here on this checklist. I just want to make sure that that's going to work best for staff.
So we're,
I think if we did it topic by topic would probably be
By
most
topic,
helpful, because we could get
okay.
clear direction on
Let's
that
start.
decision point.
Okay.
Mr. Joy?
Yeah.
So let me just
Right.
talk, I'll just talk about the lead question. So I looked at lead neighborhood development. It looks good. It's very comprehensive. It's not very deep, but I think if we were to incorporate that as an overlay, that's a requirement for how we approach every development that comes forward, and separate that from any kind of density bonus. I think that would be good. At least I'd like
Mr.
to study
Blackman, I'm
that.
sorry stopping you, but the way we are going, I'm thinking to say yes, no, we don't have time, we have another
Well, I have more to
item.
say than yes, no. I mean, I think this is
Then you
important.
can pass on it maybe at this time.
I don't understand.
No.
I can't give my,
What's
my
Mr.
direction?
Garcia, we have at 5:30, and each item, if we
Sure.
start
We're going to-
explaining it, this is gonna be hours and hours. Maybe
Well-
we have to postpone this to next week.
It's up to the council, Mr. Mayor, up to you and the council how to proceed. I do believe council, staff obviously needs some direction, and I think, I understand why council members would want to explain where they're thinking on certain positions rather than just giving yes or no. So it's up to the council ultimately how to go, whether to continue through this discussion this afternoon or to continue the item. I think those are probably the two options at this point. Because I
Okay.
could understand why a yes, no would be very difficult for council to
All right, then I
go on
would
this
say
point.
we have to continue this, because we have another item. Do we have to go through item number 3, community which one? Yeah, discussion and direction regarding Alex Theater?
The Alex Theater item is something that council asked for us to bring back this week from
Yes.
last week. And so my suggestion would be that you most definitely make a determination on the Alex Theater today.
Okay, then we have to postpone this item, number 1, right? Item number, yes, one on the list, which is what we are discussing, the
If I may.
anti-specific plan. We have to postpone it then.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, I don't
Yes.
think, I'm not going to have this much
Comments.
on every topic. A lot of them
Okay.
are yes, no. This one in
But
particular
still, I
is
don't
something
think we
that
will
I've
make it. There
thought
are
about.
5 of us, or 4 of us. Each person takes, let's say, 10 minutes, will be 40 minutes. And we are 5:32, it's going to be 6:10. Then we have Alex Theater, will be at least another 20 minutes, 6:30. And then maybe we have to have lunch, so it will be 7. I don't know if that's proper or not. I would suggest to postpone this item.
It's whatever pleases the council. The only information that I would provide council is that each week, each Tuesday, we have a number of items scheduled for the afternoon. And so it just pushes us into a scheduling conflict, and we'll just have to push things out farther. As long as council is amenable to that, we can always bring this back on the 21st, Mr. Mayor, whatever the council pleases.
Is that okay with my council members? Because we have to discuss the Alex Theater today. Next week, we are off. So,
I will, I'll defer to you, Mayor. I know that what we're doing is just giving staff
Direction.
some direction, and it could be as simple as a yes or no, save our discussions and arguments for when it does
Future.
come back. But I think even if the fastest we go, it's gonna take us at least 20, 25
Yeah.
minutes, and we have the Alex.
right.
Then, then my blood sugar starts dropping and I get angry. We don't want that.
I think
I
we
don't want that.
postpone this item if it's acceptable. I mean, everybody
Then
is
we won't
okay
feel
with it.
rushed. We'll have a little more time to go
Right.
through and.
And then we review it at home again, and we're gonna come up with better ideas. So let's postpone this.
Sure, not a problem.
Let's go to the next item, please. Mr. Ajemian.
Next item would be community development regarding discussion and direction regarding Alex Theater management funding in future. It would be a motion authorizing staff to prepare and issue a request for proposals seeking qualified respondents to submit a proposal for the operation and management of the Alex Theater.
Thank you. We need Councilmember Kasakian back. And thank you, Paula. Now you can,
Do I need?
Recuse myself?
At
Yes.
this point, let's wait for
You-
Mr. Kazaki to
bye-bye.
come back, and then at that point, Councilmembers Brotman
all right.
and Devine can state their recusal. I think he's in the back.
Rivers, can you come back?
Mr. Brotman, you may go first on this one, and then I'll just ditto.
what?
Yeah, I just state the reason for so I am recusing from this item. The reason is that I received a campaign contribution from either a former or potentially still current board member of the Glendale Arts.
I think she's still on the board, yes, sir.
She's still on?
I think so.
Okay.
And then Councilmember Devine?
Okay, I have to recuse myself for the same reason, having received campaign contributions from a board member of the Alex Theater, Glendale Arts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, now, Mr. Ajemian, do you have anything to add?
I do not. There are no callers on the line.
No callers?
No callers.
Okay. Is there any comment from my colleagues, or you, we are going through this, or just?
For the Alex Theater, sir, Ms. Darlene Sanchez is here. If you have
Oh,
any
okay.
questions related to this item, you can provide information. We have a PowerPoint if you'd like. We leave it up to you, Mr. Mayor. But if Ms. Sanchez can take you through the presentation really quickly, it's short, very short, yes.
Very short.
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Sanchez, very short.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. This is just to recap what we came to last week, holdover agreement with Glendale Arts, which we approved last week, And the two remaining items, which was the request for proposals for the management of the Alex Theater and an organizational audit. You gave plenty of direction related to the request for proposals process, and that will be incorporated into a draft RFP. And that direction includes many metrics that were already included in the previous manager agreement. I'll read through these if you'd like, but this is what we heard last week. Council still has a programming preference for what the Alex currently does, which is retail facility with community focus, but you would be open to other submittals. We will not include a set mandate or limit or require a specific amount of days of bookings. We'll ask proposers to submit a rate card as part of their proposal, and that rate card would list any subsidies. The city continues to have a preference to be able to use the Alex for city-specified events. We will require an annual audit and a presentation of the operator's budget. However, if management fees are being requested, budget approval would also be required. There would be no changes to landlord or tenant obligations. Tenant would continue to be responsible for all tenant improvements, interior and exterior maintenance, as well as utilities. And we will not set a management fee as part of this RFP. We would be open to hearing what proposers would have to offer. And then as the second item before you is the hiring of a firm to perform an organizational audit. Staff did receive 3 quotes from theater consultants that would be able to conduct a thorough review of Glendale Arts. They all have experience working with other historic theaters and in performing organizational audits. All 3 have confirmed that they do not have a conflict of interest with either the Glendale Arts Board or Glendale Arts staff. Staff recommendation remains Arts Consulting Group. However, we are pleased with the experience provided by all 3 of the submittals, and we look for your direction on how to proceed with the firm selection, and we can discuss your preference for timing with the audit and RFP. And that concludes my comments, and I can answer any questions about either one of these items.
Didn't we discuss that you had preferring the company which is called Arts Consulting Group?
Yes.
I mean, the staff. See, the problem I have with it is first, there are 3 people who is on this report, I'm sorry. On the report, I see as those who will work on this project. Am I right?
Correct.
Okay. Then it says president, the salary of president is 300. Apparently, president is not gonna be involved with this project. Those who will be involved with it is senior vice president and vice president who are not in Los Angeles. They are somewhere else, okay. And then we have one person, Mr. Sean Ingram, senior advisor. And what I have problem, as if that, I don't know, but that is this, is not an employee of the company. I don't know if it's corporation or whatever this organization is. As if like, since he's in Los Angeles, they called him in to help them. He has been there working or cooperating with them since 2015, and this is the person who would work on it. So kind of, I'm not happy with it. And the second thing, they offered, or they want 17,500. So obviously, president is not involved with it, so senior vice president and others are involved. The average salary is, like, let's say $225 per hour. 17,500 would be something like 70 hours to spend on this project, which I'm not sure if we want them to go through all the documents, everything, how the Alex has operated for 3 years, if that's enough. Now, I refer to my colleagues if they want to comment. Mr. Najarian, am I clear what I'm discussing?
Right, well, you are, and I'm, so my concerns are a couple. Number one are we know that the scope of work is the same with all of them. Each of them seem to have audited similar sized and similar situated performance theaters in Southern California, or actually in, yes, all in Southern California. So for me, I'm zooming in, and there's no conflicts, which are good. The things that I'm focusing on are right in the middle there, the cost estimate and the time with which to complete the objective. Web management, I'm going to assume that the qualifications are equal amongst all three. Web management wants 40 to 50, let's say it's 50,000 and take 4 months to deliver. That price is kind of high. I find it a little bit on the high end, hard to justify. The next one is the venue tech. Their price is more reasonable at 25,000, but it takes up to 6 months to deliver. And we know that the clock is ticking on our management agreement with Glendale Arts until December 31st. So we might not get the audit back from these folks until into January, let's say February at the latest. And we're going to be in a tight spot towards the end of December, having to renegotiate with Glendale Arts or anyone else to continue negotiating. The arts consulting group, the price is good. The time in which they're going to deliver is certainly within our time frame. So I'm kind of leaning and not knowing in detail about the qualifications of each and every auditor. And I'm just going to assume in my mind that they're all equal. And maybe that's a false assumption. But with that being said, I'm leaning towards the arts consulting.
Okay.
I mean, my mind is open for further discussion on it, but that's where I'm leaning. They can do it for a right price in the right amount of time compared to the others.
But one question I guess I raised before is Mr. John Ingram, who is residing in Los Angeles. Is he just, they call him on case-by-case basis, or he's an employee of this organization?
He's an employee of the organization. However, Douglas Clayton, who is the senior vice president, would serve as the project lead. I had a conversation with him to share some of these concerns on our end. And what he said is a lot of work they're doing now is not in person, through WebEx, through Zoom call. And again, this is one of the more experienced firms. They've done organizational audits like this many times, and they do recognize that Alex is special and different than everyone else. But a lot of that work can be done remotely. The couple of things that cannot be done remotely, like in-person interviews and facility review, would be done by Mr. Ingram, because he is local. They identified him as somebody that would be able to do
Did you say he's
this.
an employee of this organization? Did you say that?
He is with the organization, yes.
With the organization and with lots of organizations. But whether he is an employee of the organization, that's what I want to know. If you don't know, you may ask, but.
He's going to, on behalf of this team, he would be doing work for this team and would contribute to this audit.
Okay.
Oh, he
So we
would,
don't know he's full-time employee of the organization. He will work with this organization. Right?
when I spoke with the senior vice president, he implied that Mr. Ingram was with the company and would represent the company. And again, whether that is, I did not ask specifically whether he was an employee of that company, but in every way he would be acting on behalf of that business.
Okay.
Based on the information provided by the company, and if I can read it directly so that I'm not in any way, adding any information to this, Mr. Ingram, joining experience in nonprofit fundraising and management in the arts and social services, joining ACG in 2015. So he joined the firm as an employee in 2015. Mr. Ingram serves on the firm's contributed revenue enhancement team, supporting a comprehensive international roster of clients with strategic fundraising and interim management solutions. So based on what they have provided us, he is on their team and employed by ACG.
Well, that's not the way it says here. It says his firm's contributed revenue enhancement team. Contributed is different than being an employee.
And at the end of the day, Mr. Mayor,
As I
members of the
said,
city
I'm
council,
contributing to
if
it.
that's an issue for the council in terms of his employment status, whether he's a consultant or an employee of the firm, we have two other organizations that could do the audit just as well. So it depends on council's comfort level, hence
But
the three options.
Mr. Mayor, let me just say that,
Yes,
to me,
Mr.
I concur what Councilmember Najarian said. I think timing is a factor here. Cost obviously is a factor, and given the current pandemic, where someone is located, I think, is secondary in our analysis, unless there's other factors. The individual in question may be someone who contracts with the company and does work on a project-by-project basis. The reason this one particularly I'm leaning towards is because they've done work for a neighboring city of ours, for a playhouse, I believe it was, right? So at least there's some familiarity with the arts scene and culture and environment here locally. Hopefully that comes into play with the analysis or factors into it somehow. And so, I mean, I can tell you that I am not going to support an expenditure of 40 to 50,000, but I don't see what the added value is of spending almost $8,000 or $7,500 more for the venue tech firm. So given that these are our three choices, I think we just go with Arts Consulting Group. They appear to be qualified. We'll see what they do. I think we've given clear direction to staff as to the things that we want them to look into, and then we can move on to the next step, which would be the issuance of an RFP.
Okay, so here we have it. So now what's next, Mr. Garcia?
You okay with that, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah. Oh, you
We'll
already.
keep an eye on that guy, though. What's that guy's
I'm
name?
okay with it. I
We'll
just.
keep an eye on him.
I'm just concerned. I didn't have any problem with this.
So the other question we have is the RFP. Do we want to do the RFP at the same time, or wait till the audit comes and then do the RFP?
No, let's do it at the same time that they can start the work, right?
I'm okay with that. I know about Mr.
Are you okay
I
with
think
that?
that was your idea, wasn't it?
I would rather have it separated out. I'd like to see the results of the audit, because some of the findings may factor into what we write into the RFP.
But then may take a lot of time because something comes up and they have to work longer.
But we have nothing but time. There's no performances or anything going on anyways. I mean, worst case scenario, and I hate to
Something
be.
comes up with the company themselves, that something happens, there are difficulties to reach or get document or interview. I don't know, that's why.
Will we be working on the RFP, getting it ready for issuance? And council have the ability, worst case, this drags on and on with Arts Consulting Group, and we realize we better get going. We could then come back and say, okay, we're gonna issue the RFP at this point.
That is correct, we can do that.
So we have a safety valve, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
If it drags, it'd be good to get that information and see what the good and bad things are that are happening at the Alex and incorporate that into the RFP, but if you can't wait for that to happen, we can always pull the
No,
trigger
we
on the
can do that
RFP.
and see how we proceed and where we stand in a month time. Yeah.
Is that okay? Is that good? I mean, I'd like to get the results back also, and we could very well have that if they stick to their timeline, and we'll be okay to put it in our 6 month.
I think the only thing we'd note for the record, and Councilman Najarian, I think you kind of referred to as the management agreement and the lease are 6 months. We could be running up against that, so if you run them concurrent, if you don't run them concurrently, you might end up having to come back and look at that management agreement for another short-term extension.
Can we get updates?
Yeah.
Perhaps as this goes along, they're almost done, another few weeks or whatever, that way we'll have a sense of comfort as to
Yeah.
we have enough time to do the RFP and.
Well, I guess
We'll provide that as-
the more important question is, how long would it take to develop the RFP? We know how long, according to this contractor, it's gonna take once we cast our vote today for them to come back with the audit results or findings. So how long would it approximately take for a RFP?
This would be a high priority, and we'd want to make sure that we get we get sent to the right places so that we have people know about this, 2 to 4 months. So I think it fits within this. I think, it just depends on your priority. We can either one.
I mean, I think that given that there's nothing going on, look, I'm fine with either. I just don't think that we should issue an RFP out, or work towards we can start work on the RFP. Our staff can start working on an RFP, but I don't think it makes sense to do anything further on it until we've had a chance to digest and look over what the findings were from the audit.
Okay, that's fine with me too, but I just want to hear from the company on regular basis. Not that they go and 2 months later they come with a report to me.
We
Just
will,
wanna
we
know
will
where they are
provide,
step by step to be involved with this process.
step-by-step involvement with the process is not something that, we will provide updates in terms of where they are in their audit. As they're doing their work, we'll provide that by way of a weekly report that I provide the city council to provide you with information related to, they're 2 weeks into it, they've completed X, Y, Z. In the next phase, they're going to be doing in-person interviews. So we'll provide you that kind of information. Ultimately, you will get a report from this company that will provide you, based on the scope of work that is outlined, information related to that scope of work and an audit. That provides council with that information.
And also I want to get in touch with them through Zoom in the beginning, that why we are doing this, what we are doing. I just want to make sure that whoever is involved, that we can discuss with them few issues.
That would be one-on-one interviews, Mr. Mayor, members of the city council, in terms of stakeholders. I would anticipate that they would have those conversations with the city council.
Okay. Is there any other item, Mr.?
No, so it's motion time, I guess. So I will move, and I'm not sure how this is going to be set, but I will move that we select the Arts Consulting Group.
That's 3B.
3B, to insert Arts Consulting Group in the appropriate spot in that motion. And I'll also move 3A, that staff begin the process of the RFP creation, but not issue it until further direction received from council.
So
A
we have a
procurement not issue.
motion on 3A. Is it clear? The motion is clear, Mr. Garcia?
I think so, and there's also a resolution appropriation.
Oh, yeah, and I'll move the resolution of appropriation for the funding.
So we
I'll
have
second.
A, B, and C.
Correct.
Together?
The Arts Consulting Group as the entity on 3B.
I'll second the motions as they were made. I'll second Councilman
Second.
Najarian's, yeah.
So we have the motion, we have the second, roll call, please.
Councilman Brahman, Devine, Kasaki,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Mayor Agajanian.
Yes.
Motion
Next,
to adjourn?
Move to adjourn. Second.
Okay. So we are adjourned at 5:55 PM.
Mr. Mayor, when would you like to commence the city council meeting?
Postpone the city council
6:30.
meeting to 6:30.
Sure.
Yeah.